President, thank you so much for speaking to Bloomberg. Talk to me a little bit about your economy. So Colombia is growing faster than most of its neighbors, but there is concern that actually there's a lot of unemployment. The unemployment rate, especially amongst urban populations, is higher than in other countries.
Let me separate both topics. In the first part of the question about economic growth, we finished 2019 growing above 3%. That means we're above world average, about regional average, about OECD members. It's a good number. The important thing is we also got high levels of investment. More than 20% increase in foreign direct investment, and increased 10% in tax collections, reducing the deficit. Now you asked me about unemployment. And yes, it has increased, not that much, because actually considering that Colombia has received 1.6 million migrants from Venezuela, we have been able to absorb part of that shock with the economy growing. And the challenge that we have for 2020 is that all the investment that was made in 2019 should be seen now in the performance of the labor market. The challenge is the amount of people asking for a job. Considering the migration crisis, it's now bigger than the offer we have.
But President, we heard from a Nobel laureate who has come to Colombia that he's worried that you've increased the minimum wage too much, which is why you see growth okay, but unemployment still high.
I disagree respectfully with that opinion, because the increase that we have generated in Colombia in the last 2 years is an increase of 4% in real terms.
Okay.
That increase is in order to have more capacity for people to buy in the economy, and it's also to compensate years where the increase basically was destroyed by inflation. So I think now, when we assumed office, we decided to increase the salaries, and we saw in 2019 that Colombia had the largest increase in household consumption in almost a decade. So I think that has also been positive for growth.
But if you see it as a trade-off, so if unemployment were to stay as it was, or even increase, would you decide to decrease the minimum wage? It's just trying to understand your thinking.
The important thing is, we have tried and we are pushing hard for the creation of formal jobs.
Yeah.
When you look at the evaluations we made on November and October, we are now generating more jobs than previously. The expectation for this year is that the investment that was made in 2019, based on all the incentives that we created, is going to generate more jobs. And my expectation in my administration is that we will end the administration in 2022 with an employment level below 8%, which will be the lowest in 30 years in Colombia.
Can your economy grow 4% this year?
That's my bet. That's where we're heading to. What can be obstacles?
Derailing, yeah.
Obviously, the challenge of the migration crisis, one. How does the world economy perform? Because if we get the global economy growing a little bit more, it will have a positive effect in Colombia. And also we'll see how some commodity prices behave around the year. But one of the important things is the growth we reached last year is the highest growth in almost 4 years, and that's a very important signal for Colombia.
We've seen protests in the street. Will that impact your growth?
I consider that most of the protests that we had are now being managed throughout a national conversation. What I mean by a national conversation is some people have asked to have an acceleration on closing the social gaps. Many of those problems were inherited from the past, and we're trying to tackle them. How? We have the biggest budget on education and health, and also we're trying to accelerate the creation of jobs for young people. We believe that the conversation that we have in all the roundtables that we have is going to give us important elements to undertake reforms locally and nationally. And I think that can bridge among society members to unite in common purpose for the future.
Okay, so what are protesters asking for? Is it pension reform? Is it labor reform? And will you present a pension bill this year?
Many people were saying that I was going to present a pension reform. It didn't happen because we did not plan to present any reform. We believe that it has to be a consensus. And why do I believe there has to be a consensus? Because in Colombia, only 1 out of 4 people older than 65 years have access to a pension. So if we don't close that social gap, that is going to turn in long-term poverty. So we have to solve this in a way that is sustainable, but can also provide more accessibility to Colombian citizens.
But will we see a pension bill in 2020?
what I have said publicly is that between the government, the workers, and the private sector, we have to agree in a mechanism that can ensure that more people in Colombia have an access to a pension. The access to pension system is a principle of equality, and we will continue always to search for that.
But what's the chances of this agreement coming together this year?
I think there's an important chance because this is for the good of the nation. Who can be against of allowing more people to have access to a pension? Who can deny that that's equality? Who can deny that that's positive for a country? We have 22 million people working in Colombia. Only 8 million people are contributing to the pension and social security system, but less than 3 million are getting a pension. That, if we continue like that, is going to generate more informality towards the future. So I think a consensus in order to expand the base of people that have access to a pension is one of the things that are needed the most in Colombia.
In Bogota, the metro has had quite some investment by a consortium led also by China. How much more investment are you hoping to get from China, and will that hurt your relationship with the U.S.?
It was a public bidding. Yeah. It was a public bidding. And when people ask me, what's your opinion about Chinese investment? I want Chinese, USA, French, Italian, wherever it comes from, because investment in a country generates growth and it generates opportunities. And in the case of China, China is the U.S. #1 trading partner, and China, in the case of Colombia, is #2 trading partner. So what we believe is countries that want to invest in public biddings that are transparent and that are in favor of the citizens, in mobility, in electricity, in whatever, are very important for our nation. So we will continue open for investment.
Will that irk the U.S.?
I don't think so. Why could it? How could it impact negatively on the U.S. if the U.S. has China as their #1 trading partner? The U.S. has a lot of Chinese investment, and actually there's a lot of Chinese investment even in U.S. government debt. We don't see this as a geopolitical battle. We see this as calling for international investment in the country. It was a public bidding, the Bogota Metro, and a Chinese corporation won the bidding because they presented the better offer. I will continue to invite more countries to actively participate in all the biddings that we have in strategic sectors.
President, you're here in Davos. What are you asking of people you meet with? Is it to try and get investment in your country?
We want to get more investment in Colombia. Last year, foreign direct investment grew almost 20%. A very important growth. I'm also calling for people to come to Colombia and support the projects that we have in terms of renewable energies, and something that we said yesterday. We want to actively participate in a 1 trillion trees initiative that was launched in the World Economic Forum, and we have committed to plant 118 million trees by 2022. So I've also called people here in Davos to look at Colombia as a place to support the fight against deforestation. And last but not least, calling for other organizations, for governments and business leaders to support the Venezuelan refugees that we have in Colombia.
President, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.